Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
What's the darkest side of humanity you've ever seen? Episode 2. My mom was a principal in an elementary school. There was a mother who was pretty obviously poisoning her children. All three of them had appendicitis simultaneously and needed surgery. Then there was the case of the girl who came to school with a fracture in her arm, product of malnutrition and handwashing and twisting her dad's jeans. Then there was the case of the kid who had to sleep outside the home unless he begged in the streets and brought enough money to pay for his parents' cigarettes. In all those cases my mom had to report to the authorities, but they did absolutely nothing. A few years ago, during the pandemic, I was working at a grocery store gas station. One night, someone came in and told us there was an old man in a wheelchair that was sitting around the corner of the store by the propane tanks. I went out with the customer to check on him, and it looked like he was sleeping or dead. Fortunately, he was not dead, but was clearly in distress. It was summer in AZ, and it was 110 degrees outside. He was disoriented, didn't speak much English, and it became really clear that there was no way he made it there on his own. He'd been abandoned. Whoever dropped him off had left him with a water bottle, a bottle of vodka, and a pack of smoke. We called the police for a wellness check, and between us we figured out that he was from an assisted living facility in the next town over. He was combative, probably suffering from some form of dementia, and they finally got him into an ambulance after a couple of hours. The only bright spot was the woman who brought him to our attention. She had some experience in crisis response, and called her kids and said she would be late coming home. Whomever dumped him at our store obviously left him there to die, but he lived for another day because of a kind stranger. My wife and I were almost involved in one at a concert in the 80s. I grabbed her and pulled her back when I realized what was happening. We hid in the stands as thousands of people were getting smashed together trying to get to an exit. People thought there was gunfire, it was just someone that lit off firecrackers during the show. Security was screaming for everyone to get out. I told one of them to go away when he demanded we leave. It took several hours and there were a ton of ambulances hauling people off. They claimed no one died, but I don't believe it. I think the stadium paid some people off to keep their mouths shut. I was kidnapped, I was gone years. A lot happened. I can't live in my country anymore because the guy who did it is out of prison and will kill me. I was advised to leave. Because there is no help to keep me safe. In a class I was taking last year, they were talking about human trafficking and our book talked about where human trafficking victims most frequently are tattooed and kept, etc. And it listed where I was tattooed by my kidnapper. It was a really weird experience to read. I live in a perpetual state of tiredness. I can't go home, and when you aren't in your home country you don't belong anywhere and have to justify your existence constantly. I can't remember the last time I relaxed. I lost years of my life after I came back and went through court. I was a complete shut-in for a long time and ended up homeless then with family. I feel like I was pulled out of the river of time, and even though I was tossed back in, I'm not supposed to be here anymore. I've never seen anything personally, but the worst things that I know about Unit 731, who did countless experiments on live human beings. This did, however, advance medical knowledge. As awful as it is, there was something that we got from it. The worst thing to happen to a single person would have to be Junko Furuta torture from several boys who really just picked her at random. These boys never suffered any consequences due to ties to the Yakuza, if I remember correctly. That story still gets me pretty emotional years after hearing it. I grew up in a small town. My little brother has always been a gentle, empathetic soul. He would always bring home hurt animals to nurse them back to health, write thank you letters to his teachers, that sort of thing. There were only 10 to 12 kids in our town, all boys. They violently bullied my brother. One day my brother came to me in hysterics and said the boys were torturing animals. I went with him to see what the issue was. The boys were ripping the legs off of lizards, mice, birds, insects etc. and putting them in battle royal cages where they would flop around and slowly bled out. Some of the animals were screaming in pain. The boys' age range was from about 7 to 10. They were laughing hysterically and making bets while watching it. I've seen much worse things in my life. I work in social services, but I think about that day a lot and how violence is so easy and entertaining to so many men. I can't argue that all 7 of the kids there had serial killer tendencies, which made me think that people in general were just bad. You bring that little thing with kids up an order of magnitude and you have underground dogfights, then human fights, then assaults, then horrific wars. I don't know. I think women are obviously capable of horrific individual acts, but something in men seem to find entertainment and purpose in violence. How we were all okay lying about the origins of COVID, the building of enhanced viruses, people recommending treatments that got people killed, the complete corporatization and politicization of our medical system, and now that COVID is essentially endemic. No one wants to talk about it anymore. COVID was probably one of the biggest human rights abuses that we all experienced though, deserves a Nuremberg-level international trial, and yet no one does anything. Poachers for sure. And factory farming. The fact that people are more interested in money than respecting beautiful creatures like tigers, elephants, and rhinos. I could go on as well, which is the scary part. I'm lucky to have never seen any major crime, but animal cruelty hits different for me in a bad way. I am the kind of person that gets angry with teenagers for building forts in the woods, so you can imagine how I feel when I see shot elephants without their tusks. Also, kind of a smaller one, but in elementary school, kids would make it a game to see how many ants they could step on and kill. That just messed with me idky. The comments under websites such as LiveLeak, Run the Gauntlet, Best Gore, and so on. Man, I've seen incels writing entire paragraphs about how much they hate women and what horrible things they do to females they know if they won't accept their advances, or also male partners who wrote about how they abuse their spouses, people planning the murder or the assault of neighbors/coworkers/friends/family members, PETUS writing about how they'd abuse children specifying which ones, often family members. Commenters laughing about dying people and how they deserve it or maybe how they'd plan a murder or how they'd kill a black person if they saw one, etc. All these comments didn't sound like edgy cringe, they sounded worrisome, alarming, and sad. I know people might tell me welcome to the internet, and say that I was born yesterday. I know, people on the internet control, I know there is worse, but still, this kind of stuff makes me shiver. These people sound serious as hell. These people can easily be people you know when they're out there dreaming about killing children and like that. It's disheartening. Late to the party, I won't say what my job is, but I was woken up one Saturday to a call I was told to check Telegram, and I watched the atrocities that Hamas committed. I didn't see the shooting of the music festival, but I watched the aftermath. I saw what they did to the women and children I watched as a mother and child were burned alive. Not a day later and people were claiming it didn't happen. People still claim it didn't happen and that why I lost my hope in humanity, the compounding strength of the attack, and then people claiming it didn't happen. I see their faces in my sleep. I can't take it anymore. I wish it would stop. I have seen so many horrible things, but this was worse because most of the videos were live. It made it so much worse. It took me all day to find a seat in Vancouver to watch the Stanley Cup game in 2011. I managed to find some room down West Georgia at a little Mexican restaurant. My friends came, and we watched Vancouver lose and left. It wasn't a big deal, love hockey but prefer watching live so don't follow often. I was walking with my girlfriend, and I started noticing strange things. There were a lot of people in the street, but I started to notice garbage cans knocked over, and people we were passing had a different energy, like they had too much energy or something. They definitely weren't the relaxed crowds I'm used to. Then we came to an intersection where porta potties were tipped over with their contents leaking everywhere. people jumping on top of them, and saw my first garbage can fire of that day. Things are not looking good. I looked down at each of the streets from this intersection, and I knew we couldn't get through them easily or safely as everyone was looking for trouble. I really loved this woman, and her safety was paramount. I spotted an empty parade, so she rushed there, and we walked up the 5 stories of the building and began to watch from the top of the building. What I witnessed that day taught me a lot about people. It started with a brick. Some guy spotted this random brick and threw it at a store window. It bounced off, so he picked it up and repeated his attempt to break this window. This violence drew the attention of many onlookers who stopped to watch. Then one of them picked up the brick and began to help him, and soon enough, the whole street was nothing but first world, privileged, spoiled chaos. At a time when people were rioting in the Middle East for their rights and democracy, little rich girls in miniskirts and heels were helping to turn over cars. People were robbing stores, beating each other up and trying to break, burn, or destroy anything they possibly could. At one point, there was a group of 5 riot police and they had to retreat. The crowd was uncontrollable. These police officers were getting rocks thrown at them from every direction, so they huddled and made a circle. Some kid ran up and kicked an officer in the one moment he took his eye off the crowd to check where he was going, and the crowd erupted in cheer. We had the choice to go to any ledge of the building, and we were surrounded by this riot. I think it was about 2 or 3 hours before we could leave, and because public transportation was stopped, we were stuck. We stopped by a store and picked up some fine cheeses, baguette and foods and had a picnic in Cole Harbor, furthest north and away from riot you could go, while plumes of black smoke rose from a city I would never look at the same. I thought what I saw was bad. The series of photos that ensued from thousands of phone cameras among rioters revealed much worse. Teenagers hitting seniors with skateboards as a crowd watches, people getting gang stomped by a crowd simply for falling down. It actually broke my heart. But let me share some knowledge, please. I used to spend a lot of time out in the bush. The only dangerous animal you will encounter is a hungry one, but even then you know what to do and what to expect. When it comes to people, this no longer works. What makes people so dangerous is you don't actually know what their intentions are, and they can create a specific experience for you of them that they think will fulfill their aim. One bushman told me to never be in the middle of a crowd. I don't know how he learned that, but after what I saw, I will always be outside of a crowd if I'm ever in one. Listen to this old bushman, he has learned from the greatest truth, the land, not from the greatest lie, human society. I remember drinking at a bar when I was about 19 or 20 and a guy showing me a video on his phone of a lad in America who can only have been about 16, hogtied and gagged on the ground trying to scream for help and begging for mercy. The shot also showed about 4 other guys the same age, maybe a year older, standing around him as they taunted him. All of this is clearly recorded on a phone, and they tell him he's going to die as one of the groups produces a cheap sword from the back of a pickup. He chops at the neck of the bound lad but doesn't get even halfway through. Over the course of several minutes, the group takes turns to hack and chop through the neck of their captive as he slowly bleeds to death. I'll never forget how the person who showed me that footage laughed and how it changed the way I thought about people. When I was younger, I stayed at a friend's house with a couple of friends. We were maybe 15-16. One guy had his laptop and went on one of those gore websites and showed us a video which I guess was some sort of cartel execution. The guy had to be executed was on his knees, hands tied, and one cartel member held him by his hair whilst the other sawed his head off with a serrated knife. It seemed fake at first, but once the knife had started to make its way through his neck, the noises and half-gurgled screams still stick with me now over 15 years later. I remember saying that was sick, not in an effective way. And my friend said that wasn't even the worst one and went to play another, and I said if he played anymore around me I'd knock him out, and I meant it. Everyone else agreed. I know worse is out there. But to watch someone slowly beheaded will always be a reminder that there really are some sick ducks in the world. I was sitting in a hospital room with my sick mom, and someone wheeled over a patient and left her in the hallway. She was jaywalking and got hit by a literal bread truck. Unfortunate thing had a neck brace on my neck and was moaning in pain. A technician came over after some time and just typed on their computer thing. The woman asked for them to please call her family as we're in GA and her family is in PA. The tech just looked at her face, gave a quick nod, then scooted away with the rolling computer. No one called her family for a long time. She was in the hallway moaning for hours, much longer than my mom had been there. Towards the end of my mom's ER stay, a police officer comes over the woman still strapped to this board, leans over her, and says, "You know this is your fault, right?" and let the ticket they wrote fall to her chest. I was so shocked that they did that. She and I were shocked. She begged the officer to call her family. They didn't want to but asked another nurse to call. Her family didn't recognize the number, so they got angry at the call, hung up, and when they redialed, just didn't answer. I was so shocked at how the whole thing went down. She was really by herself on that one. What happened to her? I was working at the time during COVID lockdown. It was a cold storage warehouse. I was a food quad for Home Chef, yes, the subscription box, so it was a comfortable gig until 2 months later. We were in a private meeting, and were informed that the company will no longer pull bags off the line with spoiled ingredients. They claimed loss of funds for this. Because once you pull one bag you have to pull it all. So, the same night I pulled a bag for having a moldy potato. We had to pull the remaining bags and check each one. This process took less than 5 minutes and we were back up and running. They put me elsewhere because I was affecting quotas, so I'm put at a table where the bags and meals are packed with produce. I had a driver grab me some cases of peppers. He brought me 3 pallets, all of it rotten and stinking up the floor. I informed management because each pallet following was rotten. Turned out they bought near spoiled products to save money. They still use their same tactics of buy near spoiled save cash. I was fired 48 hours later for stopping production down for the remainder of a shift without proper approval. They are more than comfortable with selling bad unsafe food to people than spending money on good products. Back around 2005, my grandmother on my dad's side suffered a stroke. She was in her mid-80s, and it hit her really bad. Completely unable to move the left side of her body, no coherent sentence formation, couldn't use the bathroom by herself. She ended up in a hospital a little over an hour away, and though we'd come see her a few times a week, it was mostly my aunt and uncle, both my dad's older siblings, who were there 24/7. When my grandmother died, it was in the will to split her money, about $195,000, evenly up amongst her 3 kids. My aunt also ended up getting her house and car because she'd moved in and took care of her for years before the stroke. My aunt swore up and down that, one of the times she was sitting in the hospital with my grandmother, she told my aunt that she could have all the money, to not have it divided up evenly like the will said. No proof, no change in the will, just her word this happened. My parents didn't believe her, because how was a stroke victim going to say this? We'd been in the room while she tried forming sentences. I can still remember her babble clear as day. There was no way. Of course, my uncle, being the pushover he was, ended up giving my aunt his share of the money, which left my dad's share. But he refused to give it up. I still don't remember all the details of what happened, but I think my aunt ended up suing my dad for the money. She didn't win, of course, but ended up cutting us off from that side of the family for years. We ended up not being able to see my cousins and their families, or even go to my grandparents' house, because we were ostracized from that side of the family. That included me, an 8-year-old, about which my aunt said, well, he's from their loins, so he must be a greedy son of a bitch too. Like, how do you say that about an 8-year-old? All for $65,000. She ended up dying in 2014 from stage 4 lung cancer from a lifetime of smoking and spent the rest of that money on treatments too little too late. Even on her deathbed when we went to see her, I recall her telling us in a raspy voice to get out. My cousins reached out after their mother had died, and we've been reconnected ever since. We go over for Easter and Christmas every year. I found out later she basically lied and gaslit my cousins before anyone knew what that term meant. The one I like telling people, because of how ludicrous it is, when she divorced their father, he'd call ahead to let her know he'd be coming to spend time with the kids. And as soon as she got off the phone, she'd pack the kids up and they'd have a day trip somewhere, so when their dad got there to see them, the house was empty. Then she somehow spun it to make it seem like he was intentionally skipping out on them, to turn his own kids against him. I don't say this about a lot of people, but I'm glad she's dead. Reading in Mauthausen on how Nazi scientists talked about research on my great-grandfather and how it proved that certain groups were inferior, and afterward seeing where and how the experiments were done. Absolutely no regard for the fellow man. The saddest part for me was that all the memorials outside did not understand what needed to be remembered. All memorials were for certain people groups in specific. None for people in general that were murdered. I grew up stupid and poor. Like one of maybe 2 or 3 white kids in the whole neighborhood. Mom worked multiple dead-end jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. Dad drank any money he had. The usual day-to-day stuff in the hood would give anyone PTSD. You learn fast not to feel too much, not to ask for anything, just keep your head down. When I was about 13, I heard about a fight club of sorts that the local gangsters would put on. The high-ranking drug dealers in the neighborhood would get together at their parties and throw some money in a hat. 2 guys would fight. The winner gets the money. The price was usually between $50 to $100. A hungry kid with a high pain tolerance could eat pretty well on that. I saw dudes beaten until their face looked like hamburger meat. Guys would get knocked out and start seizing. Loser walks, if you can't walk, they put you in a truck and dump you down the road away. I took my share of whooping and gave my fair share too. But some of those guys were just savages. Luckily, the guys running the thing had some level of decency because they wouldn't let young guys fight older guys unless it was beef or something. That's probably the only reason I'm still alive. A lot of the older guys had done time and were still prison strong and mean as hell. Those were the guys busting people up. A close teenage relative of mine tragically took his own life. About 300 people showed up to the funeral. Many people brought cash-filled condolence envelopes for the family. A lady went around introducing herself as a member of the family and said she had been designated to collect these gifts. She disappeared with between $12,000 and $15,000. Police and FBI got nowhere. Nothing was recouped. I have some real tragic dark side of humanity experiences that I do not want to share online, but one that I will share was when my neighbor was cremated alive in a house fire. The entire neighborhood was traumatized by her death, because A, we all knew and liked her, and B, she was heard begging and screaming for help from the upstairs bedroom until the roaring fire overtook her. 2 days later, I was traumatized and unable to process what had happened. So, to help cope, I went to church to be with my friends. The story had been in the news, so they all knew of it. Instead of people asking me if I was okay, all but 4 individuals were making jokes about it. Most were apathetic, dismissing my grief as a possible lack of faith. One of the leaders was offended because I was upset about the death of a non-member of the church. The person who solidified his name in the Hall of Fame came up to me while I was talking to 3 guys who were sympathetic, slapped me on the back, and gave me a hearty, "So, I heard you and your neighbors had a big cookout this week." Then he laughed off. I left and never went back again. It was apathy and callousness at its worst, and it was coming from people who bragged and back-pat themselves about how much they love their neighbor. Haven't seen that bad, but working in the hospital, having kids forcing parents to change their goals of care to either one, have them die so they get their inheritance now too, force them to stay alive so they can steal their pension/disability/etc. checks. Worst I've seen is a daughter saying to change her mom to DNR, do not resuscitate, while the mom was in the room. The mom didn't speak English. The doc told her that her mom was still competent and didn't want that, so her word goes. The daughter then suggests giving her mom a sedative so she goes unconscious, then the daughter will be the medical power of attorney and then they should change her to DNR. After being shocked for a few seconds, the attendant pulled the daughter aside and had a private conversation, presumably about stopping trying to murder her mom. Goals of care were not changed for the mom, and she recovered fine and went home. I found 2 little white cats in the summertime. I couldn't take them into my house because I already had a cat at home and my mother wouldn't allow it. So, I make them a cardboard home and bring them food every day. Then I went out of town for a week and when I came back I couldn't find them. The cardboard houses were completely destroyed, and a few days later my friend's brother says they were both crushed by children on bicycles. They did it on purpose. I just don't understand people. Worked as a helper for a church Santa event that did free photos and toys. I should have known it was going to be a bad day when parents were shouting to their kids to give the toy back and get a better one, but I wouldn't have predicted that it would eventually disintegrate into a gigantic brawl when some got caught sending their kids through the line more than once and told they couldn't do that. The police officers who responded were not surprised. I used to visit a website which basically have the uploaded videos of death, murder, gore, everything evil you can imagine. One of the worst videos displayed 2 men on the ground tied up in a desert-like setting. I assume it was Mexican cartels. Anyways, a guy with a chainsaw takes the first guy out, while his partner sat there almost emotionless, whether it was pure fear or courage. The chainsaw man didn't like that and took it personally. Once he dispatched the first man, he pulled out a knife and proceeded to behead the second man violently. To anyone curious about searching for these kinds of videos, I caution you to not to. What it did to me growing up was a massive fear and cynical outlook toward humanity. I became very untrusting due to knowing the capacity for a human being to inflict on another human being. I knew someone, we were close. I found out through a mutual friend that he was caught airdropping customers' nudes from their personal phone to his phone when they dropped their phones off for service, since he had their passcodes and airdropping can't be tracked. We worked in a technology store where it was normal for customers to leave their phones with us. I had no idea. Once his mutual friend told me, we both reported him to the highest management we could go through. We went over some heads too. I cut off all contact and blocked him, and he subsequently lost his job. Heard he's incredibly poor now and kind of suffering. Good. In a span of a year and a half, he had collected over 750 nudes. One of the first ones is of his younger stepsister. Massive ick. My friend who told me said he confronted the guy and said, "There's literally free porn on the internet," and the guy legitimately replied, "It's just not the same if you do it to a stranger's photo." Feels even better when you know them. He can rot. I think he is. ATM, he just had to sell a majority of his assets by he can't find an equal paying job. I'm an amateur martial artist and work out from time to time with a 65-year-old lady that also volunteers at a battered women's shelter. The place is pretty secretive, as some of the victims are actually hiding from an abusive relationship. My training partner wanted me to come help her demonstrate some very rudimentary techniques to help build some rapport with the ladies and a safe male. I was able to get through I think 2 hours of this, before the reality of what I was doing really set in. We always trained in hypotheticals. If a person grabs you this way, do this. Here I had a 16-year-old child with a 2-year-old baby that was showing me how her abuser did grab her, asking me what she could have done to get him to stop. For the first time in my life, at 35 years old, I broke down crying like a little baby. I'm over here giving information we give to everyone like I'm some kind of expert. And here this little waif of a thing that didn't even reach my shoulder had been through a harder time than my hypotheticals prepared me for. I specifically worked with her for several more weeks, and I'd like to think I had some positive influence on her and the baby's life, but I'll never know. Not dark in the morbid sense, but in an unadulterated desperation way. While in Venezuela a woman came running at us from the jungle begging us to take her children. They were incredibly young and each one skin and bones and each one had horrible bug infestations/parasites. The husband was abusive, they had no money and depended entirely on fruit trees / what she could scavenge. We took her to town and got medicine / food for a few weeks, but ultimately it was heartbreaking to leave them in this state. Most people have never seen true desperation like this, actual starvation, and hopelessness to the point you're begging any foreigner you see to save your children. On behalf of my dad. I'm sure almost everyone has heard of this one. I come from a small town called Lockerbie in Scotland, and I wasn't born at the time of the terrorist attack, but I know many of the firefighters who dealt with the situation. My dad was driving down to the pub, he was the designated driver, with his mates, and they saw a few bangs in the sky. They arrived in Lockerbie and the whole town was aflame. Bits of dead body, clothes, plane, etc. People found whole human bodies in their loft, and some people on the plane still lived through the fall and died on the ground before they could get any help. One guy was fixing his neighbor's bike when the plane blew up and landed on his house. His entire immediate family died, everyone except him. He later committed suicide by jumping off a bridge in the way of a train. Most of the firefighters I know still can't get rid of the memory of some of the stuff they saw that day, and what makes me angry is the fact that we aren't even sure who did it. That's the deadliest terror attack in the UK. If you would like to read more about it, look up Pan Am Flight 103 or Lockerbie bombing. I know I didn't personally see it, but I think that since I'm from the town where it happened and below some of the people that responded to the scene, and even just witnessed it, I figured I could respond to this question. If anyone has any questions about the bombing, I'll try my best to answer them, but I may need to ask those who were there if I don't know the answer. My Mormon aunt and her husband had a much younger female roommate in their house, pretty much as long as I could remember. She always came to family functions and took care of my cousins. Well, turns out their roommate was my uncle's second wife. She never had any formal schooling and her parents set them up when she was only 15. She soon got pregnant with twins. She didn't know how babies were born. After my family found out, they stopped all communication with us, and I haven't seen them in years, but I think about them all the time. I did naval rescue operations during the ISIS takeover of Syria. Every week we would find rafts that shouldn't hold more than 12 people filled with 100 plus people stacked on top of each other floating in the ocean. Many times, the rafts would have no survivors. The people on board would pay a smuggler all of their money / belongings to get them on board, then the smuggler would take them to the middle of the ocean where they were supposed to hop onto a larger vessel. The larger vessels didn't exist, and the people were left in the ocean to die. The smugglers would get picked up by a smaller boat with armed men. I still wonder how those smugglers were okay with committing mass murder over and over. My child was in the ICU of the hospital for a while. The girl in the room next door never had visitors of any kind for the months she was there. She was a newborn / incredibly young baby. When her condition got for the worse, we overheard the nurse on the phone talking to the parents. When she got off the phone, she said that the parents did not care to be there any earlier than Wednesday of the following week. This was on Friday. Their only request was to call them just to let them know it happened. The girl died less than 24 hours later. The parents presumably never showed up. It became clear from some conversations we had later that the baby was abandoned when they postnasally discovered it was sick. The parents did not want her anymore. I have two stories, and both happened in different countries, India and UK. I was going on a road trip with my family at night in India and we were on a remote highway with minimal street lighting. We suddenly saw a lot of liquid on the road in front of us and quickly realized that it was blood. Soon after that, we saw a dead cow and a lot of fatally injured, bleeding cows laying there fighting for their lives. We could only assume that some kind of cargo truck had hit them. We called the relevant authorities that we found online because that was the only thing we could do in that moment. I was walking back home from work after my bartending shift with one of my colleagues. We were both university students, and we saw someone laying on the pavement in front of us. The person was mumbling some incomprehensible words. When we went a little closer, we realized that it was an incredibly old, looked older than 80, very drunk homeless man who had his head busted open. There was a lot of blood on the floor and all of his stuff was scattered across the area. The shameful fact was that this happened in a terribly busy area, not too late at night in front of a Sainsbury's right next to the University of Manchester, and no one even stopped for a second to even glance at the poor fellow. When we called 999, they said that it would take around 4 hours for an ambulance to arrive since he was still breathing, which implied that his situation was not critical, even though the NHS emergency center was literally a 5 to 10 minute walk away from where the accident had happened. We ended up picking the man up and carrying him to the hospital ourselves. I still don't know if that man was okay after we left him at the emergency center. I've been at a hospital, ERC Denver, where they treat the most acutely ill eating disorder patients in the nation. I've seen things that were so inhumane, so apathetic, so abhorrent, so impudent, that it has led to 6 suicide attempts since. I never thought that humans could do things like this to other humans. There was a patient on our unit and one day she was forced to go to the quiet room. All it has in it is a restraint bed and a restraint chair. Staff dragged her in there with a crowd of 8 staff all huddling around the door to the staff hallway where the quiet room was. The memories of hearing her scream as she was restrained and forcibly intubated against her will haunt me for as long as I live. I have seen staff laughing at patients struggling or crying or screaming while in restraints. Staff seem to use them with no due regard to who is in them or to who is on the other side of the glass. I've heard people smashing their heads into walls and thought that it was building work that was being done only to find that it was a friend of mine. Staff were literally laughing for joy as this child was forcibly restrained and put into a restraint chair. I remember reading the back of it and it said to never leave detainees in chair for over 2 hours, and yet people were left in them for up to 12 hours a day. Staff refused to take people to the restroom, so we would regularly have people urinate or defecate on themselves and into their clothing because staff were too apathetic to do anything about it. Staff would make fun of patients who struggled with OCD behaviors and staff would regularly single out this one person because of how they ate. I'd always find them crying in the corner after meals because of how upset they were because of the staff insulting them. Staff are also undertrained. This one child went into a seizure because staff did not realize that the nasogastric tube was likely placed intracranially. The patient left in an ambulance. Things were so bad that one patient tried to kill themselves by trying to eat the contents of an instant ice pack, another consumed over 20 Tylenol and Motrin tabs at once and went into cardiac arrest because of their other co-occurring conditions. They were on the floor for over 5 minutes before anyone called 911 or started compressions or got an AED. Things are so bad there that many patients would self-injure daily, if not hourly. There were blood splatters on the wall from when they didn't clean the unit enough. One time I relapsed so badly that my pants were completely soaked in blood. They had to get a red biohazard bag and put it in there because there was so much blood on them. Things are so bad there that there was an escape attempt from patients. It only led to staff tackling them in the stairwell and there were multiple injuries. One nurse at the facility showed up to work drunk and inebriated and actually administered the wrong medication to multiple patients. They had a concept of treatment called room-based care, where patients were isolated to their rooms and only allowed to go use the bathroom, but this was routinely denied. There was a designated pass corner in most rooms because staff didn't care enough. I will end with a quote from a review of the facility from someone who worked there. The way they talk to the kids and the way they treat the kids is ridiculous. They don't even treat them as kids. It seemed as though our approach to treatment had to be it's our way and only our way. ERC is not open to different ideas, is not open to listening to their patients, multiple stories I could tell, and not open to listening to their staff. At the Willow location, staff had their cars broken into, stolen, and had multiple incidents where homeless people made it into a stairwell and were following staff from behind pleasuring themselves. Tell me, does this seem safe for staff and patients? In regard to patient care, they expect patients to go from eating nothing to eating everything right away, and if they don't, they use fear to motivate them, telling them that will move up to a higher level of care if they don't start completing, or threatening them with tube feeds. The way they treat their staff is outrageous, and if you are looking for a job, look somewhere else. It's not an isolated incident either. Restraint, sedation, and willful apathy are the rule, not the exception. And to end this, I can say without any doubt that ERC smothered any will to live that I have. I'm planning my suicide on my 2-year anniversary of being there. I can't live with what they've done to people. I can't do it anymore. I want to die. I may still be alive, but ERC killed me when I was there. ERC killed me. I can't take it anymore. Mine is pretty lame given the circumstances. But a girl overdosed at a party, everyone including her boyfriend completely abandoning her because they were afraid of being arrested. Thankfully, I knew CPR and was able to resuscitate her, which I know was dumb and I should have called paramedics before trying that, but I was 20 and panicked from being left alone with an overdosing girl. To this day it still haunts me how willing everyone was to let this young girl die out of self-preservation. Worked in the medical department of an animal shelter earlier this year. I have no medical experience of any kind, so I just cleaned the kennels. As the only guy on shift in that department that day, they relied on me to be the muscle. They told me we had a dog coming in for euthanasia. The size was unknown, so I had to gown up and get ready. Turns out it was an abuse case. They said he was convulsing on the drive over. When the dog arrives, we see that his front left arm was nearly blown off. Just dangling. Only held together by only a few strands of skin. Turns out the poor boy had walked into a neighbor's yard and the guy directly shot him with a shotgun. I had only clocked in 2 hours before, but I told my boss I couldn't do it that day, and they let me go home. They arrested the guy less than 15 minutes after euthanasia. I wouldn't say this is the darkest side of humanity I've ever seen, but it just happened today, so it's fresh in my mind. Someone abandoned a puppy right outside my work in broad daylight. Left her with a backpack full of food in a grassy spot in our parking lot. Luckily, she was distracted with a chew toy, so she didn't leave the grass, but she could have easily been hit if she'd gotten bored and wandered. Hurts my heart to know that someone dumped her there intentionally. She's a sweet pup with a great personality, can't be more than 1.5, maybe 2 months. Thankfully, my boss has an extensive background working with dogs and has a lot of connections. She got her to the vet for her vaccines and found a place for her to stay overnight. One of my coworkers is in the middle of getting his house ready to at least foster her, maybe adopt. Thank goodness for the pieces of humanity that are good. Recovering addict here, and let me tell you, the things I saw others do just to feed their addictions was mind-blowing to me. I think the two that really stuck out with me the most is this one old acquaintance I had stolen $200 out of his friend's dash literally just minutes after he had wrecked and totaled his car. The other one was when I was letting a friend stay with me while he was homeless for a while. He stole I think like $150 to $200 from me. So, long story short, never trust a meth head who's still stuck in the grip of their addiction. I was on a trip in Cape Verde once with my parents and friends. I remember that the whole main island, Cape Verde, is an archipelago called Sal, was basically this big massive land with exclusive 5-star hotels, casinos, and well-armed security on the shore, while the rest of the island was basically a wasteland. The tour guide offered us a ride across the island to an abandoned salt mine, or it was something else, but closely related to mining. We agreed, hopped on a pickup truck, and went happily hoping to take some beautiful pictures. We weren't quite sure where we were going and how we would get there. The tour guide then showed us happily a shortcut through the slums. While it was hot on the island itself, once we drove into this part of the land I could swear the temperature went up like 8 degrees Celsius. There were shacks made out of old metal containers, wood, and dirt. The island, from what we were told, suffered from a literal dog infestation. They were everywhere, always running behind you, mostly aggressively with intent to bite. The people living there, in the slums, were very visibly starved, often running naked, especially the kids. Because of the dogs, there were feces and trash everywhere. Sometime into the trip, before entering the area, another pickup pulled up, loaded with really drunk and loud tourists. Once we drove in, one of them jokingly threw a half-eaten sandwich on the ground. At once about 4 children and some dogs ran at it, beating each other and fighting for it like their life depended on it. Those pieces of things continued laughing and even teased them with water bottles before dumping them right on their faces in a very visible, arrogant awe. I was so furious I nearly broke down. This was 5 years ago, and it just keeps coming back from time to time. I was 17 and had just graduated high school. My mom had asked me to run to the local gas station a few miles down the road to pick something up. I drive there, and as I'm pulling up the stoplight before you turn into the station, some sick person throws a little gray and white tabby kitten out of the window as hard as he can. The man driving behind him doesn't have enough time to stop and hits the kitten. Both drivers sped off and didn't stop, not caring at all about what happened. This all happened right in front of me, and I stopped in the middle of the road, hoping I could save the kitten. I've always been an animal lover, ever since I was a kid, so it was instinct for me to try to help. The poor little thing was alive. His eyes popped out of his head and flopped to the side. His guts were exposed, and he was crying in pain. I completely panicked and didn't know what to do, so I picked him up and cradled him in my arms until he went limp, only about 2 minutes, but felt like eternity. He died in my arms, and I was coated in blood, crying, and having a panic attack. Another kind, older man helped me snap out of it, took a cardboard box out of his truck, and put the kitten's body in it, helped me clean up and pulled my car into the proper parking lot of gas station. He also called my mom to come pick me up, and she showed up like 10 minutes later. We ended up burying the kitten in our backyard in the box, wrapping him in a towel and planting some flowers on top of his makeshift grave. To this day, almost 10 years later, I still have nightmares about this event. So, to the man in the silver sedan who decided to kill an innocent animal in such a brutal way in front of a Sheetz in rural PA, I hope you burn in hell and suffer as much as possible. When I was around 16, I had an extremely abusive older partner. It was an LDR, thank God we never met, who was 25. When I, the child in the situation, wanted to end things as nicely as possible, he found someone to send me something horrific specifically to traumatize me in revenge. It was a short clip from Daisy's Destruction, which I YKYK. I was 16 and had a full mental breakdown over this. It was horrific. I still can't hear children crying without having a flashback and breaking down. Thankfully, the police officers my parents called understood I wasn't intending to see that, and someone had sent it to me, so I didn't receive any legal trouble from it, but this short clip I saw truly traumatized me for the rest of my life. A number of things come to mind. I grew up in a gang and in a time where violence between families was normal. Generational family feuds, because someone stole an axe, someone's grandmother refused their arranged marriage partner, which resulted in the would-be groom's family targeting her grandchildren, basically stupid reasons. But the two things stayed with me. Seeing someone's face getting bashed in with rebar when I was 6, he was 14 and his crime was that he was the nephew of some guy that owed that person money. He somehow survived, but never saw him again after seeing him air medevaced out. The second thing that has been with me happened recently. Had a cousin get taken out for a Starlight tour. He was attacked in his hotel room while on a video call with his kids and wife. I guess he tried to fight back and tried to call security but got ignored. He somehow managed to make it back to the city after a 50 kilometers walk through fierce winds and -35 temperature. The police weren't helpful, and the hotel turned a blind eye and refused to turn over any vids of that night. There are other things that have happened, but these two events made me jaded. Not directly, but I saw a video on YouTube of a man who drank a lot with his girlfriend at the time, and when they met that night she called him by the wrong name, and he killed her. When investigators got there, they said there were chunks of flesh in the pool of blood. He basically shoved several items in her like a bottle and a curling iron and a few more things. Then he removed her intestines with his bare hands through there, disemboweling her, and he tried to play it off as if she asked for it and she just died. That case has stuck with me for years. The victim's name was Maria Namath. He doesn't deserve to be named. I grew up with 3 good friends as we were the only kids at bird dog field trials. Their last name was Savage, so they were the 3 Savage boys. Good people. I came home in 5th grade and my mom was sitting cold in the chair facing the door when I got home. The oldest of the 3 boys, somewhere in his teens, was driving his 2 younger brothers and his mom somewhere. He took a swig of Gatorade and barreled into a concrete wall. The younger brothers and the mom died. The eldest lived knowing he killed his whole family. It definitely rocked my world as a kid. Would not even know where to begin. I survived the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. I have a lot of up-close and personal past experiences with criminal organizations. As a child I was abused at a Catholic boarding school and then gaslit and manipulated by 2 adult male detectives, held captive in total isolation by the school to cover it up, and eventually expelled for it all, having done nothing wrong. As a teen I was trafficked by my own older best friend. I attempted suicide as an older teen and my mom left me to bleed out after telling me I was ruining her vacation. An acquaintance took me to ER. I could go into detail on any of these. I am actually very much healed and happy now, but yes, I'm uniquely accustomed to the worst of humanity. This seems tame by comparison, but I saw it firsthand. Just lived through a Cat 5 hurricane here in Acapulco. Power was out completely for a week in a 1M people city. Gov says 90% back, but reality is like 50% after 2 weeks. Turned Mad Max by day 2. Every business looted, pillaged and destroyed, sometimes not even for supplies, just for the hell of it. It's amazing the level of destruction people are willing to unleash as soon as water and refrigeration are not a thing anymore. This is a story a gym teacher of ours told us. Quick claim, my English isn't that good, sorry if some words are in a strange order lol. He was a retired veteran. He used to work as a guy that drove a truck that had special equipment at the front to detonate claymores/anti-tank mines. Now this doesn't sound all too bad. But sadly, during his last war, and if I remember correctly, it was in Iraq, the local army there used children/teens with Down syndrome or other disabilities to walk on the fields, to speed up the progress of clearing the field. He has seen a couple of them just blasted into infinity, because they successfully found a mine. He did that for a while but had to retire because an anti-tank mine exploded underneath his cabin. He did not sustain any injuries as the cabin was reinforced, but that was the limit for him. He then went back, had taken therapy for a long time, and decided to do just a regular job, but not full-time as he was not capable of doing due to his never-ending PTSD. Just the fact they used people with Down syndrome/disabled to clear a field/road of explosives. As he was not capable of doing due to his never-ending PTSD. He of course did not agree with it, and many veterans complained about it. But the simple answer was, this is what it is. The generals and stuff attempted to negotiate with the local army, but the local army insisted this was the fastest and safest option. Not me but my dad. My dad, who's looking at retirement now, came home about 15 years ago in shambles. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't talk. Took a long shower. There was something that messed him up so bad that my brothers and I couldn't seem to ask him what he saw until about a year ago when he seemed to have healed over it. He said he had a call for domestic abuse, stabbing. Showed up with a few other officers and they said one of the parents of a baby less than a year old couldn't find the child, the other parent refused to disclose where the baby was, so a fight broke out, one stabbed the other. If they lived or not, but my dad said after about 5 minutes of looking around the house, they found the missing baby jammed into the bowl of the toilet. Psychotic event. Long story, my room being close enough to the nurse's station, I am able to overhear the majority of their conversations. One morning they thought they were being quieter than they actually were, and a few of us overheard the nurses making bets on which psych patients they could get to fight each other that day. Later that day one of the patients broke a hairpick and mauled his hand with it, and 2 others got into a fight, or one of the patients got removed and placed onto another wing of the ward with more time for evaluations required added to his stay. There have been other comparable moments, but that seemed to me to be one that lacked common empathy for other beings going through some of the roughest psychological waters the human mind has the capability of cooking up. They were all very mentally ill and needed a lot of support. Ultimately, they were good kids in bad situations. But in my first year, there was a boy who everyone talked about for weeks. They spoke of how funny, smart, and caring he was. Everyone seemed to love him so deeply. I was excited, and when he first showed up, we were really close. The only problem was that he was addicted to fentanyl. When he first started coming, everyone now spoke of how agitated and emaciated he was. Soon, the tiniest thing would set him off, and he was often running off to get high in the bathrooms. Our building had no ventilation, so we had to evacuate on multiple occasions, and there were several weeks where I would feel sick all day from the effects of him smoking. We did everything we could to help, but his parents never believed that he was the one doing. Even when they found his drugs, his parents blamed everyone else. I've never seen anything scarier than his angry tantrums. He would punch walls and throw desks across the room. He loved to scream slurs and turn the hallway into a mess. Nothing could calm him from his tirades. He even assaulted one of my good friends there. He hated being sober so much that he would smoke on the bus to school and somehow would sneak his paraphernalia through wand searches. He would scream, cry, fight, run, anything to get another hit in. Addiction is the scariest thing that humans face.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.